Hi, my name is Carol Zarakor. I am an occupational therapy assistant professor and an occupational therapy doctoral student at the University of St. Augustine in Florida. My project is a historical view at classroom management. The project was difficult to narrow down to one subject, so I will be looking at various things over the history of education and how the classroom has been managed. The objectives for my project include to define historical periods of classroom management, to discuss the progression of teaching styles, and to discuss the progression of discipline styles. Classroom management has changed historically from colonial period to the current 21st century. In the 18th century colonial period, the focus was on the moral order of society and preparing men for college, for service in government, and for service in the church. In the early 1800s, the focus was teaching large numbers of students, including the poor, and teaching them basic education and morals or religion, also focusing on prevention of rebellion from the landless wage earners. In the late 19th century, the focus was on professionalized education, at which point girls were allowed to go to school to learn to teach, and trade skills were brought in. In the earliest 20th century, it was considered a producer society. They were industrious, and immigration played a role at this point. They were worried more about the physical aspects of learning rather than moral health. And the primary purpose was for citizenship and worthy home membership, and only secondary, the command of fundamental processes. In the late 1900s, it was considered a consumer society with equal access to education. And now in the 21st century, it is more lifelong learning is the focus, and the global community, as well as citizenship. In the early national period, the classrooms consisted of one room with multiple ages and all levels. There were often times that students did not attend due to having to tend to their crops. Lessons were individually or small group recitations that had been taught by the instructor. And there were long periods of school where some students were unsupervised due to the recitations of the other students. Moral order and honor was expected for the teachers and the classroom. And if that didn't happen, the schoolmaster ruled by fear and shame. Some of the punishments included switches and whips and paddles, tapping on the knuckles with rulers, standing in the corner facing the corner, and also standing with a book outstretched in their arms or standing on one leg for a long period of time. During the early 1900s, Joseph Lancaster started a monitorial system, and it had a very impersonal authority where there was one teacher to hundreds of students, and monitors were assigned to monitor the group. The headmaster was more authoritative. He taught with humiliation. However, it was quite interesting that there were no complaints regarding discipline from the parents. And the Indians and the industrial poor were brought in at this time for education, and it was free for them. And the monitorial teacher teaches the monitors who then teach the students. It was more of a military model. It was quite ritualistic. There were rewards that were given for good work, such as trinkets and toys. However, if the students were bad, it was they had some pretty severe punishment. There was no longer corporal punishment from a beating sense, but they would suspend children from a cage from the ceiling. They'd put a truant card around their neck and tied to a desk in front of class. But they did receive quite a few rewards for good work. In the late 1800s, the classroom management is more of a professionalized education from the teachers that have gone to school to teach. And they taught with a soft pedagogy and an affectionate authority rather than from humiliation and the authoritative headmaster approach in the early 1800s. The classrooms were smaller and self-contained with whole class instruction. And they wanted to make learning pleasurable. They did put a lot of emphasis on guilt and conscience, such as if the student was out of line, all the teacher would have to do would give them that look, and that would keep them back in, get them back in line, so that because they would feel guilty about whatever it was that they had done. And they disciplined also by removal of affection. So when the teacher becomes angry at you, she removes herself and no longer is affectionate. And so the students didn't like that. And corporal punishment was reserved strictly for the working class at this period. Promotions, demotions, and external motivators were a part of the classroom management. And this was the precursor to the report card at this period. So one of the first report cards did come out during the late 1800s. During the 20th century, in the progressive era, the teachers taught from a hierarchical professional-client relationship. Administrators came in and began monitoring the teachers. They were taught with feelings, where feelings and judgments were not a part of classroom management anymore. And the student-centered approach was started, where there was more interest and pleasure in learning. And they focused on physical rather than moral health. In other words, they were more concerned about the lighting and the seating and the comfort of the classroom rather than what was morally right or wrong. And they felt that the misbehavior during this time period was due to what the previous expectations of strict attention and stillness and silence brought on. So the misbehaviors were from that, therefore they were giving them more freedom in the classroom. And they felt that they had better classroom control by using groups and whole classes. And this is where learning by doing started. There was more self-direction. Students were given a little more self-control over what they wanted to learn and how they wanted to attend to their studies. And they were free from the artificial restraints at this point. During the post-progressive era, classroom management consisted of a set curriculum. And there was competition in the classroom, looking at who has come out on top, who's the valedictorian, who's the salutatorian. And teachers were rated on their ability to stress positive behaviors. They were being monitored by upper administration. And therefore, they were to reassert their authority and provide summative tests and positive discipline. The behaviorists and the constructivists came in and assessed students' outcomes from positive rewarding systems and how positive rewards were more functional and had better outcomes than the corporal punishment. So punishment was then privatized, meaning that there was no more public posting of grades. If there was punishment, it was done in the principal's office and not in front of the class. During the 21st century, the classroom management was based on globalized education, or is based on globalized education. It's more web-based. It is collaborative and multi-component with games and technology. And at this point, corporal punishment is considered a public threat. The 21st century teacher becomes a coach and an advisor and a content expert. And corporal punishment, I decided to pull out a little bit and show where the corporal punishment is still allowed in some of the American schools. As you see on the map here, it's kind of amazing at how many schools still allow it. And there was a ruling by the Supreme Court in 1977 that said that punishment in the schools is still allowed and not considered cruel and unjust. And in 2011 and 2012, there were more than 167,000 students that were paddled. The conclusion that I've come to is that over the years, there's been a lot of changes, but there's also been some things that have stayed the same. Teachers still teach and students still learn. Punishment is still there. Corporal punishment is still very much in the education system today. And it's also dependent on where you're at as to what type of punishment that you get. But I would like to hear from you as regarding how your classroom management plays a role in academics. What do you think about that? What do you think about the technology and the classroom management practices? What modern technology is improving understanding, or is modern technology improving understanding? And do you feel that better classroom management improves the results of the students? And what type of classroom management would you prefer to have? Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this historical view of classroom management. And here are my references.